Welcome to Haxby Shed. Now, if you watch my channel, you know that most of my videos are about engineering, but I do put in other topics besides. And this video is about my dad. Now, it's a happy video. My dad's not died, but he's in a care home and he has severe dementia. And today, in fact, I visited him for the first time in a year. Because of the COVID restrictions, I couldn't visit. I want to tell you about him. It's just a diary note about my dad. So I'll tell you a bit about him and even a bit about his parents, because to understand my dad, you really need to understand his parents and the things that influenced him as he grew up, and so a bit about his story. And to make that work, I'll do it as a voiceover on the PC. Now, there is a slight link to engineering here because my dad was a machine fitter, and for about 35 years he worked for Rowntree's chocolate factory here in our home city of York, England. So it would be him that got me into engineering in the first place. So there is a link there. It's not just a completely random diary note. That's the end of the introduction. I hope you enjoy it. It's not meant to generate any particular feelings of sympathy or anything. It's just about my dad.
These are my father's parents, I'm guessing sometime in the mid-1940s. My grandmother had been a widow from the First World War. Her husband had been killed about 2 weeks before the war ended in France. And so she found herself on her own and ageing, perhaps. And she met my grandfather because he'd been lodging with a friend of the family. Now, by this time, it was 9 years after her husband had been killed, and my grandfather was 40 and generally considered to be a confirmed bachelor. Anyway, my grandmother started walking out with him, and her own mother was disgusted that she was walking out with another man, having only been widowed for 9 years. And this led to a bit of a falling out and a great upset. But my grandmother was determined that she was going to have her chance to get married. So about a year after they were married, my dad came along, and here's a picture of him about the time he started school. And he was born at the beginning of the Depression, and his father had no regular work for about 10 years. They lived in a rented house. It was quite a nice house, a 2 up, 2 down. And in the finish, they'd lived in that house for about 50 years by the time they'd passed away. My father was a very sickly child, and the family were on the means test, what's called the means test. And an inspector would come to the house and see how much money you'd got and what possessions you'd got. I think that was a regular visits. And on one occasion, the means test inspector said to my grandma, "Oh, that boy, is he still alive?" Well, he was still alive, but he missed quite a lot of his education simply because he was really quite poorly, and my granny used to push him round in a chair for, I think, a year or more. Well, despite all expectations, my dad survived and grew up, and here he is with his parents, probably about the age of 16. We think this was visiting Skegness. And he looks a little bit jolly and even a little bit cocky, I would say, there. His dad, there on the right, always walked with his cap on and his hands behind his back. And he often walked maybe a yard or two in front of the family, and that was just his way. And he barely ever spoke when he was walking. My dad had a number of ideas about what he wanted to do, and at one point he wanted to be a radio operator on ships. But his parents were determined that he had to get a trade because they'd come from a long family of labourers and where people were just not skilled. And they saw it as an incredible step up if my dad could get a trade. And so they wouldn't sign the papers for him to go into the Navy or anything else like that. But they managed to get him an apprenticeship in a company which made wrapping machines for the confectionery industry in the hometown of Gainsborough in Lincolnshire, a small market town. And so it was effectively this kind of setting that formed my dad's view on life. People of my dad's generation had to do 2 years of national service, and here's a picture of my dad about the time he joined the army. Because he was in an apprenticeship, a 7-year apprenticeship, um, he didn't have to join the army until his apprenticeship was complete. So here he would be about 21 because he started his apprenticeship when he left school at 14. He managed to rise up to the rank of full corporal, and he always said that the army had been the making of him, and he wished he'd stayed in. And I think that was probably right because it suited his personality, I think, pretty well. After my dad was demobbed from the army, he took up a job at Rowntree's chocolate factory in York as a machine fitter, and in time he met my mother, and in time again I came along. And here's a picture of me and my dad, him looking very proud, me looking very happy, we think in Scarborough in about 1963. I think my mother took this picture. It wasn't long after this that my parents separated. To be honest, they were completely unsuitable for each other. My dad adored my mother, but they really were completely incompatible. Quite unusually for the 1960s, I think, it was actually my mother that moved out and I stayed with my dad. So this left him as a guy working shifts 7 days a week, just trying to keep a roof over our heads. Now, from time to time, we would employ housekeepers, which would usually be somebody, a lady with a child perhaps, who was separated from their husband, and they would move in, and the deal was that they lived in the house and basically became my surrogate mum. There was never any romance involved. It was just an arrangement. In time, about 5 years after my mother left, my dad married somebody that he'd known previously, who was quite a bit older than him, and things went fairly smoothly. But in time, she died, and he was left a widower in his early 60s. Here's a picture of my dad on the right, probably a few years into his retirement. It was not long after this that he called me, because we were living somewhere else at that time, and said, "Son, I've met another woman." And things moved on from there, and at age 68, he got married again. And we thought at the time, well, that's leaving it a bit late, isn't it? But actually, they've been together for over 20 years. And for about 17 years of that, my dad was actually absolutely fit and fine. It was only when he was about 85 that his dementia began to show. Here's a picture of my dad and his wife in about 2014 at a family wedding. And this is about the last time we saw him where, he was fully himself. And gradually after this, he began to fade away. And it started with a little bit of memory loss, and then he started to get confused. Nothing happened suddenly. He just sort of ebbed away. And you could see it in his eyes that, he didn't really quite know who you are, or he wasn't really committed to the conversation. And then he started to ask you things over and over again. Here's a picture of my dad at his 90th birthday celebration at home. He was happy enough. He's always happy enough. Even now he's happy enough. But he didn't really know who people were, and he sort of faded into the background a bit, despite our efforts to make a fuss over him. They struggled on with quite a lot of help from my stepsister, but then my dad's wife started to get dementia, and from that point onwards it was only a matter of time that they were going to have to go into a home. And around March last year, my dad had a couple of trips. He just slid off the side of the bed and so on. Didn't hurt himself, but they couldn't really get him up and couldn't keep him up. So he went into hospital for various checks, and then COVID struck. So they had to empty the hospitals for COVID patients, so my dad was put into a home. A lot of help from our local council social services, who were absolutely excellent. But from the point that he went into the home, it became clear that he wasn't going to be coming out. Around about the turn of this year, my dad's wife followed him into the same home, and they lived there together as a married couple. She still fusses over him and tries to do his hair, but he doesn't really notice. He sleeps a lot of the time, and all of his needs now have to be taken care of, including giving him his meals and everything else. So that brings us up to date and my visit today. And here he is. He was quite chirpy to begin with, but then fell asleep. Nevertheless, I'll let him give you a few words of his own. It is incomprehensible. It's no good turning up the volume on your TV or tablet. He's happy, and we're happy that he's happy.
Yeah,
They got all tired with me then.
yeah, yeah,
And we got changed up. The simple is that they're on the top shop.
yeah, yeah,
Because they were the top shop.
yeah, top shop, yeah,
But
yeah,
then you come to when you opened Duffin Towers, toilet strategic.
yeah, yeah,
They spend,
yeah,
cheap money.
yeah.